Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today for this session. I am Jenny Jackson. I am an Alliance Manager for CUNA Strategic Services, and I am privileged to work with the Passageways team on the products they have developed for the credit union market. Our presenter this afternoon, Matt Maxwell, is the Director of Business Development for Passageways. During this afternoon's session, The Future of Your Millennial Workforce, Matt will explore how to align this generation with your organization's long-term goals and expectations. And if you've seen the first three of this series, you'll know that you're in for a good presentation today. Matt, are you ready to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. Awesome. Well, and thank you, everybody, for joining in today. This has been quite the exciting series, as Jenny described there. We're going to send out the recordings to those as part of the post-webinar survey, so don't feel like you've missed out too much. But I have tried to stay very specific in the topics and information we've covered in this series regarding millennials. We started with, just to frame the conversation, because as you all have, I've slept a couple times since the last time we've discussed this awesome topic. And we set the stage with who millennials are, what they look like, where they are, what apps they're using, where they spend their time, what are their habits. That was really part one of the series. Part two, we transitioned into how to recruit them, which is very different compared to previous generations. Their expectations in that process. What's their first day like? What day of the week should you start them? What time should they start, for instance? Some really good best practices there. And then in part three, we really talked about the continued growth and innovation when it comes to tapping into our millennial workforce for the meantime. And today, kind of wrapping up the whole millennial discussion, at least from an initial career path, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the specific leadership traits that millennials have, how we can best set them up for success long term. Okay, so in the previous one, we were talking about growing and retaining, and the difference between the two is retaining millennials historically, as we covered, was typically they're 2 to 3 years, somewhere in that range of staying in a specific job, location, role, etc. So just getting them to make past the 2-year mark is quite the accomplishment, as many of you have seen, because it's very a big thing. And then, of course, today we're going to set the stage for long-term growth. As Jenny mentioned, my name is Matt Maxwell. I've been working with our credit union community for the past 6 years. Celebrate my 6-year anniversary here at the end of the month with Passageways, specializing in employee collaboration, engagement tools, and efficiencies using an employee intranet tool, and was able to plug in rather than a stingy profile picture or a LinkedIn photo. I went with the photo from this past weekend. This is me and my son at our All-Stars game. He made the All-Stars team, and I'll actually be heading to the game tonight. So this is really a change, right? Changing of the guard as we think about millennials and where we're going. So for expectations, for today's discussion, these webinars will be very brief. They're meant to be more educational, give you some tips, tricks, things to think about, spark a discussion perhaps, and then ultimately we'll take about 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, depending on how it goes, and get you some best practices and on your way. Okay. All right, so let's get to the content for today. So setting the stage, the difference between millennials, our Generation X, and baby boomers, for the most part, millennials are traditionally known as tech savvy. In parts one, I talked about the disconnect between perceived, what tech savvy means, our traits and things of that nature. Generation X, traditionally known for entrepreneurs. Starting innovation, the .com, the late 90s, early 2000s, being able to make a huge impact in the marketplace. And then, of course, our baby boomers, who are lifelongers. The popular story or frame of reference here is this generation was proud to go work for Ford or Chrysler and put 20, 25, 30 years in, right? That was the goal, was to put your time in and retire with the same company. And through this process, we moved from Generation X from 5 to 10 years, down from 30 years with baby boomers to Generation X, or Millennials, as I described earlier, who are 2 to 3 years and have very different goals and outlooks on perceived work ethics as well. Now, why is this important? So throughout the discussions, I've done several polls, and we're going to look at some of the results as I promised in previous discussions. But traditionally, millennials make up over 50% of our workforce already there. Really just making a big jump ahead of Generation X and, of course, baby boomers falling behind there. So why is this important? Well, our 18 to 35-ish, right, our millennials, as they're coined. I've thought this for many, many years, saying I was not a millennial, I am a Generation Xer. Well, I'll explain why I had that methodology and thought process here as we get towards the end. But I do indeed fall within that 18 to 35 range. Very different outlook on how things are handled. We, again, do tend to marry late, but do already have over $1 trillion in buying power. That's pretty significant if you think about the difference in buying styles and what we can do and the power that's available at our fingertips. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit as well. So throughout today's discussion, you can also, you can see in the chat screen with GoToMeeting, you should have the ability to ask a question. You should be able to chat in there, post questions if you have any there. Feel free to punch those in. Both Kanako and Jenny will do a great job of teeing them up for me so we can make sure we address those. But let's get to the numbers, breaking down a little bit of what we found. So 60% of your staff, based on previous webinars, again, out of this 4-part series and several hundred of you signing up and attending and feedback here, 60% of your staff are millennials. That's pretty impactful if we think about, they're already there, not coming, already there. So setting the stage for next level leadership is vital to today's discussion. Now, of this, right, only 10% or less of this generation are in managerial positions, okay? So the vast majority of you do not have a large percentage of them yet hitting leadership positions, as to be expected, right, 35-ish, depending on your roles and your organizations, of course. I found the numbers to be very, very different. Some organizations had 0, others had 15 to 20%, okay? So it was not a general consensus of everybody being the same by any means. But just some good insight for you to be able to apply. And one of the trends that we're seeing is more of us moving towards universal tellers, which is something I'm going to continue to talk about as we move into our next series. And I'll talk about that at the end here as well. So business is changing. That is really, it's not news. Business is always changing. It's always moving. But the speed at which it's changing has accelerated. And why that's important is with this quote-unquote ADD generation, we want to be able to set the stage for them to be successful, okay? If they make already 40, 50, 60%-ish of our work staff and our employees, then ultimately as an organization, it's our role to be able to enhance that, to develop them, to work with them to be as successful as possible. And ultimately, long-term strategies, not just, Band-Aids and shiny objects, that keeps them preoccupied for a little bit. We need to develop the subconscious, tapping into their work ethic and ultimately their passions. I don't even want to say work ethic. We covered those in previous discussions about, the pros and cons. But I want to talk about their passion a little bit today and how we can use that to benefit them long term. Now, the glaring one, and again, sticking consistent with our previous topics, the first and easiest to grasp is a sense of community, okay? Now, how this plays into our long-term strategy is as we enable, we empower, and we give our staff the ability to tap into the external community, right, our members, our other groups as well, and allow them to work with the homeless shelters or the food pantries or animal clinics and so forth. They will take on the passion, have a little bit of skin in the game, and once they're tapped into their passion, you get exponential growth. And thus, your organization becomes known for giving back, being in the community, tapping into that next generation, the digital natives, ultimately of this. And that is a huge passion of the millennial workforce. Those who already haven't gone to, third world nations or, gone backpacking or, gone out to help some nonprofit overseas or even domestically, those are the type passions that this generation has. And it's very, very important that internally we are building the same sense of community, okay? This can be done multiple ways. You can do this through cross-functional teams. You can do this through an employee intranet. There's multiple ways you can do it. But the best I've seen is when you can get it digitally, so we're affecting all of our staff. Some of our smaller credit unions on the call, I've heard time and time again that we're all kind of in the same location, or we've got 3 locations. We're not ready for something like that. The answer actually is your staff is. It's just our leadership, our core team may not be yet. And the reason this is important is as we have this transition of staff, it's very important that we tap into these digital natives, because this comes firsthand to them. Whether we take it on ourselves or, as all good leaders do, delegate it to the appropriate person and team. Once you tap into that passion, again, you get the exponential growth, which is what we need as an organization to go long term. Cross-functional teams, if you don't do it electronically, are a huge component of this. Building a sense of community, raising money for local charities as a team, getting that buy-in are just some simple ways that you can long-term affect staff. Because if we can get bought into their passion, they're going to stick with you. And ultimately, as all good leaders know, we attract similar mindsets. So if we've got great employees and we've got them bought in, chances are you're going to attract others of the same, right? And we'll retain those as we set the stage, right? So it's very important to have that sense of community internally. Now, a new part of this discussion is how millennials perceive and how they look at being managed and being managers. They tend to look, and by they I mean me as well, tend to look at the metrics. How are we doing as opposed to the feel good? It's really looking for an Excel file to validate it in the process. It's more of a needing to be able to see what goals and information we have at any given moment. This generation really does not have time to wait for the monthly all staff, to be honest. To look for information. I can tell you, having trained and hired hundreds of millennials over my career in various roles, specifically here at Passageways, we have a culture of we've got dashboards at the front of the office giving high fives and wins to employees as they gain new wins or get a quick 10 out of 10 on helping with a customer. Those are type instant gratifications that we're providing for staff, in addition to the goals. Where are we as staff? Where are we going? Where are we to goal? And never having to worry about where are we. This is a huge change. And again, leadership styles will rely, and they rely more on the metrics as opposed to the feel good. Okay. This is one of my favorite ones, the performance review killer. This has really been on a trend, depending on the books you read and how it's handled. Performance reviews, again, I talked about this last webinar in some, they do not have the sense and time to wait a year for gratification. I covered that in detail last webinar about instant gratification and shiny objects. But ultimately, as managers, and this is why it's important, not just training them, but as leaders and managers, this is not one way they prefer to have performance reviews. They tend to have instant information, data, dashboards, information, and be able to track it real time. Right there is really a huge change, as opposed to being able to have meetings. Best practices, again, I promise to give you those throughout the discussion. And one that we've applied here at Passageways, regardless of age, is we do bi-weekly one-on-ones. They're 15-minute meetings. Either a VP or myself will meet with our staff. I've now got a team of Millennials and Generation X on our team. And we do bi-weekly meetings for 15 minutes. And I can tell you we get more done in 15 minutes than I do once a year in some formal meeting. And we're able to pivot, change, move. And ultimately, I can tell you firsthand, then your staff start to mold where you're going and change and get bought in and pivot as an organization and learn from our mistakes rather than just being told what to do. It's a very different role when you're listening, actively listening with them and being able to do it. Now, with that being said, one of the single hardest things to do is to be able to provide constructive feedback. So even though we are gauging information and metrics, specifically for this generation as a leadership style, again, we're talking about these millennials becoming leaders. I know that seems scary in some world, but when you unleash the reins, and one thing, again, actively I work on is constructive feedback. It can be very uncomfortable for staff to provide this feedback, and ultimately, if it's negative feedback, right, a coaching opportunity, we tend to shy away from that hard conversation, and some of the millennial managers feel they won't be taken seriously because of this, or feel like they're hurting that relationship with that person. So it's one of those coaching opportunities for you as leadership today. Not only training them, not just on the way you've done business, but learn the lessons, right? How to give feedback, why it's important, how to give constructive feedback so it helps both parties. Those are some of the type pieces that this generation, again, needs in a management style, and it's been pretty consistent across the way. And that brings us to one of my favorite points of today's discussion, okay? And we'll spend some time here. It's really setting the stage for mentors, and this has long been here. Hundreds, thousands of years, there's been the thought of mentors and people you look up to. But this is very important for this generation because as digital natives, there's less of that interpersonal skill set. And it's very important that we tap in and encourage, whether it's internally or externally. So in this example here, I've gone ahead and put together just a quick summary of some of the mentors I have in my life, from farmers and horse traders of business to attorneys and farm managers and camp directors and religious leaders and encouraging speakers in the area as well. A very diverse circle. So I always have someone to lean on in various scenarios. And this is very important. And I encourage all of our staff to have a mentor, whether it's their direct supervisor, which is ultimately what staff are looking for. They're not looking for a boss. That's really, again, the baby boomer generation and Generation X transitioning more into, working as a team and collaboration. Now we want mentors and coaches. And many of our credit unions are now hiring business development and coaches internally so we can change the staff and feel. I see that as a trend already, and one of the topics we're going to talk about as we continue down this autumn webinar series is really tying into the change in culture and how we can help bridge the gap. But this is very, very, very important. If you don't have those sets, you have to encourage it externally and push the limits for them to have that interpersonal skill. Some staff will buy into it, but you have to have that follow-up of, oh, great, how'd it go? Talk and learn through them, what questions they're asking, how they're pulling from those people, what scenarios they're getting into. And ultimately, that's how you set up for success. I often give the example that there are two distinct times in my life, and I'll give you a millennial example here, where I quote unquote went through my Facebook page and friends and think about it like just unfriending people and choosing who are in my inner circle and who are around me so I can better myself in the process, not just financially, but as a person, right? So I can be able to challenge myself and the people around me with the same vision. Very, very, very difficult at times, but other places it's really for the best good, and that's something we can encourage our staff again as they're transitioning from out of high school down to college. And obviously we've seen marrying late is a big part of this. I've actually got my father and my sister here in him walking down the aisle, or I should say across the yard. It was at the farm. But this is really a change, right? It's a big change as we marry late, and now ultimately we're going to see them raising families. So I do intend, as we all have been there, right? You think you're either never ready for kids, or ultimately you are, and we're really not. We just celebrated the birth of our third son this past January, and I can tell you every child's different, right? Well, with that becomes the change in roles and responsibility, thought process, all that. So as this millennial generation now hits that 30s, or late 20s, early 30s, where we're getting married and then having kids, you're going to see those early adopters start to now change into leadership roles. Mindsets change, and that's something as staff we have to work with that generation to be able to apply those skills and help them through that process, because when they come out, man, they're so much stronger. And that's why part of our one-on-ones, first thing I ask is, how are you doing as a person? What's going on? Because that work-life balance that we talked about in session 1 is all important to them. And as they know, I care, how they're doing, because if they're having a rough time right now, if they're having a rough time, then we need to encourage them through this process, because they're not going to be able to perform too, right? And there's a sense of caring. And as they're bought in long-term, now we have a family member. The Passageways family, as we often refer to our clients, and many of you are on the call, so I want to say thank you to you first and foremost as we're continuing the discussion. So this is really vital to the group. Okay. All right. So I promise you 25 to 30 minutes, and we'll start to wrap up and get there. So some of the big points from today: being able to have a sense of community. Externally, that is a big component, because we want to attract the millennial generation. We want to be able to do this. Purdue Federal Credit Union, I've often given Bob Folk and his team there accolades for and recognition for having a great social presence. I follow them on Instagram, and they're one of the only financial institutions, and again, I'm an investor in the area on the side. They're one of the only groups I follow, because they know how to market to me. They know how to get a message in front of me that I will actually read. Just a great case study on that side. And then building an internal community. This is huge. So as we all know, a community is something that is long-lasting. This is not a Band-Aid. This is not something that's just here for a month or two and then gone. This is something we have to cultivate and build and encourage as leadership, because what face it actually takes, you may not know yet, right? We have to get the staff bought in and doing it. I can tell you, with 6 years here at Passageways, we've seen a complete shift from senior leadership driving projects to branch managers running the employee intranet project. No longer do you need to be programmers and things of that nature. So before we do the last best practice and the famous quotes here, this is the interactive portion of today's discussion. So I've got a poll I'm going to throw up here. And the first one is just talking about scalable internet as we're going into the final session of the webinar series and some of those things. So give me your honest feedback, because again, we're going to provide this to CUNA and other groups. If you do not have a scalable platform, meaning end users are able to update their own content, it's live, it's alive, it's vibrant. If we merged with another credit union today, we'd have no problems, no working with them and getting them engaged. If you could just give me a quick rundown here. I know we've got a number of customers on the call as well. Looking for, it looks like we've got a number of people filling out and doing it. Just a few minutes left here. This is really key, okay? If you don't have one today, I encourage you to have a quick 10, 15-minute discussion. I'd love to have this after the call and talk about what's possible with all the credit unions we work with. And again, many of you on the call, Simplicity Credit Union, I saw you guys on here. pleasure to see you all, formerly Central City. So it's great to be part of the Faster Choice family and ultimately to feel the same thing that we're talking about now. No, most of you are not millennials, but it's a different way of working, building a community, a family feel to where they don't want to leave. And that's very different from the past. Okay. All right, so let's get to the wrap up. So unlike the generations before them, millennials don't see coaching and training as a sign of weakness. That's very, 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 very powerful. I won't read the whole quote, but I think you're getting to the point that loyalty, community, a sense of family is huge, right? And especially in this day and age with the family spectrum we have and seen, they're eager or don't know what's available, right? It's a very different, style of growing up. And this is a great way with staff. We have to take a very different approach. Oh, we still see the poll. Let me close it here for you. There you go. Thank you, Sherry. Okay, so you can be able to, here's the reference, but this is huge to be able to get the loyalty from our staff and to be able to ultimately empower them and encourage them, right, through biweekly meetings, monthly perhaps, but if you think about it this way, you've got 2 to 3 years potentially with staff, and this is the generation that are your next leaders, right? In the next 5 years, I definitely see a huge trend as they begin to marry and have children and change perspective from backpacking to changing diapers, right? That's just right around the corner. We're setting the stage for, a change here as well, okay? Okay, that's a lot of the content I had on this side. Again, feel free to punch in questions as well as chat, and I will turn over to Jenny for closing remarks here.
Great, thanks, Matt. Obviously, it was very interesting as well. As somebody who is a Gen Xer, and there's no chance of me even possibly thinking that I'm a millennial like you. I think it's great information from who are you guys to how to keep you in the workforce, keep you guys engaged. I've been pleased with it. A lot of times you're only hearing the negative of certain age groups, and I think this is a way to hear a little bit more about what the positives are and how we can engage that group and keep them engaged through technology and other means. So I appreciate that. We've had hundreds of people on these 4 series, and I think considering how many we've had attend all 4, that your information has been valuable to them as well. So what can we look forward to from you in the upcoming months?
I tell you, we're taking the next generation, and we're going to do an add-on to this 4-part series and a final close to this, and we're going to take approach with the Pokemon Go. I know it's a whole different discussion and things, but what I want to do is not just talk about the positives and negatives of it, but how it impacts our internal organization. We have followed this game, this movement, this community that has now overtaken Facebook and Twitter in usage and has created $14 million in revenue in just a few short days. And I want to talk about how we can apply some of those best practices in the now changes in technology that we can apply internally. So we're going to have a quick webinar. We're going to send that out in the survey on how to register for the day. It's going to be just 2 weeks away rather than just a whole month, I believe. So early August, look for that meeting. There's also going to be a fill in the blank when it comes to the survey, post questions, and please fill in the blanks. We've got questions about what are the biggest challenges you have when promoting millennials internally, and that's something that we would really like to get your feedback on, because in these GoToMeeting webinars, we're not able to capture fill-in-the-blank responses, and that's really key. So if you could, the last question, and the reason I do this one is I know many of you are looking for educational information. We've done enough of these webinars to know that there's some teams that really would like to learn more about how to apply some of these best practices, whether it is through an intranet or just simply sharing best practices. That's what we're known for here at the Passageways family. So if you could, this would really save both of our times, and ultimately I want to make sure that we're helping you all. So provide feedback so we can go to the next session. Join us in our early webinar regarding the mobile movement and digital natives through the Pokemon case study for our credit union. And thank you again for your time. Thank you, CUNA Strategic Services, as always. And of course, Jenny, you did a wonderful job summarizing. It's always interesting to hear what everybody gets out of these webinars. But with that, it concludes our webinar today. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. Thank you, Passageways family, for attending, and everyone else as well. And we look forward to talking with you in August. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.